So today we are looking at an essay by Mortimer J. Adler, and this connects to our learning target for this unit that says that you can cite strong and thorough textual evidence to support an analysis of a text. So basically what that standard is all about is being able to read a text and grapple with its nuances of meaning and to read between the lines. So our learning target today is to develop that skill and that reasoning ability to make inferences based on closely reading a text. So, a good practice for all learners is that when you read a text, you read it actively. And so that may mean that you need to take notes as you read. It may mean that you need to annotate, writing actually on the text. I think about folks that I know who are avid readers and those who read actively and deeply. Generally, their books are marked up. They have highlights, underlines, squiggles, asterisks with marginal notes drawn all over the place. And that's really a sign of a good and careful reader. I am a slow and deliberate reader, and I do that because I want to digest as much of the text as I possibly can. So there's a really good essay that I've posted for you to read, and it's called How to Mark a Book. And in this essay, and it was actually published in 1941, so it's interesting to see how something written so many decades ago is still very relevant for education today. And in this essay, Adler makes some comments about strategies that active readers can use, and he gives kind of some of his analogies for what reading a book truly is like. So, without giving too much away about the essay, I'm going to let you read the essay. It's posted as a PDF in Google Classroom for you. And then, as part of your assignment for today, after reading that text, I want you to respond in the Google Doc to 5 questions. And so these are just general discussion questions that ask you to think about what you've read. And then that last question, question number 5, that's the key critical question for today, is what are the takeaways? What can you take? What tips and pieces of advice can you take from Adler and be a better reader and better learner because of it? So as you read with that purpose in mind, that you're looking for how can I use Adler's advice to be a better reader, and how can I use that to accomplish mastering this learning target today? If you have any questions, you certainly can reach out to me via email, and I look forward to seeing you again. First day of class, you examined the syllabus. You're oriented to the class, you know the expectations for Campbellsville University, and you know the due dates for the major papers that are going to be written in this class. On the second day of instruction, you began by looking at a learning target about close reading of a text. And we did that by reading Mortimer J. Adler's essay, How to Mark a Book, that was published in 1941. And so part of that was to answer some discussion questions about that. So I want to take just a moment before we look at today's lesson and think about how you answered those questions. So this is what you should have submitted on Friday. The first question was, according to Adler, what must be done for a book to be truly owned? And how many books have you truly owned in your life? So in Adler's essay, he talks about you might have some books that you put up on a shelf and you never read them. The spines are never cracked and they're just there to look pretty. But there are those books maybe that you read and you read over and over again. And in those books, you highlight, you mark, you dog your pages. And so those have been consumed. That's the type of reading that he's advocating, an active reading where you read with pen or pencil or highlighter in hand, and that you're consciously working on building meaning from the text. That's the kind of reading you need to do for a college course. And so that question about how many books have you truly owned, it might be just one or two. Maybe it's a special book to you. Maybe it's a piece of fiction, a piece of nonfiction. You may have even cited a religious text that you read over and over again and that you've marked those heavily. So that's what he's meaning by truly owning a book, is one that is truly consumed, not just to be kept on a shelf in its pristine condition. Question number 2 said, what does Adler say about those who believe in it improper to write in books? Is he right? And so he says that if you believe it's improper to write in books, then that's kind of the opposite of his viewpoint. And so that was just a chance for you to agree or disagree with that. Do you think books are meant to be written in and to be consumed? I will tell you this, that in college, you have the opportunity to buy new or used textbooks. I would always go to the bookstore and look for the most heavily annotated used books. 1, used books are cheaper, and 2, I liked the benefit of seeing someone else's annotations and marks because it helped me to understand the text a little bit better. So you may find that a heavily annotated used textbook in college is perhaps the best route to go. 3 says, why should books be written in? Should all books be written in, and how do we determine which ones are worthy of truly owning? And I think Adler would say every book needs to be written in if it's worthy of your reading, worthy of consumption. I think about books that I've owned that I've read multiple times. Most of those books are heavily annotated, and they're worthy of truly owning if they're that good that you reread them. Adler says in question 4 that reading should be a conversation between you and the author. I rather like that expression because it truly is the author and you are having an experience together when you read an essay or when you read a text, read a novel, read a passage. And so if you're not participating in that, then you're not getting any meaning. I'm sure we can all agree that we've had the experience of reading a page and we'll get to the end of the page, we have zero idea what we have read. Does that ever happen to you? Of course it has. All we're doing is our eyeballs are scanning text, but we're not truly interacting with the text. And so that's what Adler means when he says that's a conversation between you and the author. So when the author says something that you question, write that question down. And so it makes it a recursive process between you and the text. That's what it truly means to interact. And then what tips can you use from the essay to improve your own ability to closely read a text? I think he gave an enumerated list of 7 different ways that you can highlight, text, underline, do a lot of different things with the text. So hopefully you were able to zero in on some of those things and write about that. Now, moving on to today's learning target. So we've analyzed, or we've closely read a text about close reading, and today I'm asking you to take that learning target and apply it by closely reading an essay. So our learning target today is to analyze a model of narrative writing. So we're in a unit that culminates on August 28th with a final draft of a narrative essay. I will give you more instructions about the topics for that essay as we go through. This portion, this week of the course, is going to be about reading exemplars, reading model essays. So the title of our textbook for this course is Short Takes, Model Essays for Composition. So all of the essays from the text are fewer than 500 words, and they are a model of a particular type of composition. So we are looking at primarily narrative and description in this first week. And so the essay that I have chosen for you to read is entitled The Bridge by Jason Holland. Jason Holland was a college student when he wrote this for a course much like the one you're enrolled in now. What I want you to notice about The Bridge is it's short, and some of the paragraphs are just one sentence. And you may read that and think, is this good writing? Well, it's in a college composition textbook, so it probably is, and you would be correct. You're going to notice that in some paragraphs, there are sentence fragments. Maybe you've been taught, never use a fragment, never use a run-on. But I'm asking you to consider, can a fragment be used effectively? What is a sentence fragment? What's it missing? So if you use a sentence fragment, what are you focusing on? What about a run-on sentence? Where could a run-on sentence be used effectively? Can it be effective? Or is it a distraction to the reading? So those are some of the questions I want you to consider as you read Holland's essay. If you look at Holland's essay and you're trying to identify a thesis statement, you're not going to be able to put your finger on a sentence and say, aha, this sentence is the thesis. We would call that a direct thesis statement or an explicit thesis statement. Holland, on the other hand, builds to an overall point, and you, the reader, will have to determine what the thesis statement is in your own word. We call that an indirect thesis statement or an implicit statement. In other words, it's implied. That is effective college level writing. So what I'm trying to move you from and move you toward is to move you away from the traditional 5-paragraph model with a thesis statement. That's a good model, and everyone needs to know how to do it. But to be a proficient and distinguished collegiate writer, you're going to have to break out of that mold and learn how to develop an implied thesis statement. It's not as easy as it may sound, because you have to very tightly control everything that is in that essay to build to an overall point. Instead of having organizational structures like first, next, finally, I'm asking you to be more sophisticated in your writing so that you have subtle transitions and that ideas are put together in such a way that the organizational pattern doesn't even call attention to itself. That is good writing. You're going to find all of that in the bridge. And so I've attached an assignment for today in a Google form that leads you through some questions about organization and about ideas. So I want you to think deeply as you read and respond deeply to those questions. We will have conversation tomorrow about why is this a good essay? Why is it a model essay of narration? And how does he effectively use description? Now, you probably understand where this is going. You're going to use the model essays that we read in class to emulate that style and that technique in terms of organizational pattern and thesis development in the essay that you write to turn in on August 28th. So the way this will work is this week we're going to read model essays of narration and description. Next week, we're going to begin working on multiple drafts of that first essay. You're going to have the opportunity to turn in a formative draft of the essay and get my comments and my review. You'll have an opportunity to share with your peers. And then finally, the week that ends August 28th, you will submit a final draft that will be summative. And that's where I will give it a score of A, B, C, and hopefully no one will make lower than a C after you've gone through the formative revisions, right? No one's not going to make the suggestions that I give you on revision of a formative draft. And so that's the agenda for today. Take time to read the bridge. And maybe what I would suggest to you is to read it in multiple drafts. We talk about writing in drafts all the time, but maybe not reading. So read it once just to get the general idea. Read it a second time to annotate it, and then read it a third time to really delve deeply into it. It's a very short essay, far fewer than 500 words. So it won't take you very long at all to read it once, and you can read it twice and three times. And then spend some time looking at the questions in that form as you submit those, and I'll be looking at those submissions that you make. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I am excited to meet with in-person instruction as soon as we can. And those of you who continue on the virtual instruction program, if you need me, you know to reach out to me. I'll be glad to meet with you individually or help you in any way that I can. Hello and welcome to class for August 18th. Today I want to spend some time looking at the questions that you answered yesterday for the first model essay that we've looked at using description and narration. So I'm going to be annotating Jason Holland's The Bridge as we talk about those questions. Before we begin talking about the essay, I just want to remind you that even if you found some of the questions difficult for the bridge, or maybe you're just unsure about what that question was getting at, that's okay. And we're going to work through those. We're going to talk about those things. And the more practice you get at analyzing an essay, the better equipped you're going to be to answer those types of questions. So if you struggled a little bit with those questions, it's no problem. We're going to work through those questions today in discussion. You're going to get full credit for having turned in that assignment and participated yesterday. But we're looking at that. Keep in mind, we're looking at this essay as a model to emulate for the essay that you're going to turn in on August 28th. So actually, by the end of this week, we're going to be looking at another essay as a model, and then we will begin talking about the writing prompt, doing pre-writing, drafting, getting some feedback before you turn in that final draft on August 28th. So let's dive right into the bridge. It's a short essay. All of these essays are going to be really short, fewer than 500 words. But you will notice something about this essay is that it is 6 paragraphs long. So even though it's a short essay, it has 6 paragraphs, and the paragraphs are not of equal length. And in that traditional 5-paragraph model, maybe you're accustomed to writing 5 sentences in each paragraph. But you'll see here that some of these paragraphs are shorter than others. The last paragraph especially is fairly short. That's a deliberate choice that the author makes, and we're going to talk about what that contributes to the overall meaning of the essay. So the essay begins right here in paragraph 1, and I'm going to work through the questions that you answered yesterday and annotate based on the questions. So question number 1 underneath organization and ideas said paragraph 1 tells us where the scene takes place and who is there. What else does it do? So if you look at paragraph 1, it begins with this statement, I can see it now. That's a very short sentence. So in fact, you count the words, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words in that sentence. So relatively short, and it sets the stage that I'm going to paint a picture for you. And it tells us the who, the 4 of us. So you've got a group of close friends out on a wood bridge puffing on our cheap Swisher cigars. It not only tells us who, but it tells us the action, what they are doing. So you immediately get the sense that this is a close knit group of friends who are just hanging out in their own kind of place, doing their own thing. The smoke rising up above the rusty cast iron sides and filtering up to the full moon above. Again, descriptive detail. You can see it. As the moon reflects off the Goose River, my friends and I sit and talk about everything from girls to UFO theories. Specific details. We sit without a worry on our minds. So it tells us the who is there, it tells us where it's taking place, and it focuses on what they're doing. So it answers that question of what with an emphasis on the action. Question number 2 said examine paragraphs 2 through 5 and in 1 or 2 words, list a subject or main idea for each one, and what progression do you find? Now, this is key to understanding organization. You'll notice that this essay doesn't say first, next, and finally. That's very elementary type of organizational pattern. So I want you to notice what we do here. So in paragraph 2, it says the bridge looks like it's something from a surreal movie with a midnight atmosphere. Located 2 miles out of town, it's hidden on a winding gravel road that sometimes gets washed out if it rains heavily. So I'm just going to label that the main idea here is just the bridge itself. So it's a description of the bridge. Paragraph 3. When we were at the bridge, we felt as though nothing could go wrong. We thought that all our problems and fears would go away if we stayed out there long enough. We felt as though our parents, teachers, and coaches had no control of us. We could talk about anything. So it's more about a feeling in this paragraph. So maybe that feeling is a feeling of being invincible. That idea that, nothing can touch me and everything's going to be okay. 4, as we sat and smoked, it felt as though we were the only people in the world. The world revolved around us. It was like we could control the world while we were at the bridge. It was a rickety old bridge, but it seemed to empower us. I like that word empower, so I'm going to use it for my main idea here. So it's about empowerment. Paragraph 5. The bridge was county property, but my friends and I felt like we were the owners. Okay, so there's the key word, and I'm just going to label that as ownership. Now, let's look at the progression. We go from the bridge. It's a place of distance, maybe at arm's length. We talk about the bridge. It's a thing, it's an object. And then we move a little bit closer and talk about the feeling that we get, and the feeling is one of invincibility. And then we get even more personal and say we feel empowered. And then we move a little bit closer and we feel like we have a sense of ownership. So if you were to describe the progression of those main ideas in paragraphs 2 through 5, and those are the body paragraphs. So we're talking about body paragraphs 2 through 5. And in those body paragraphs, we move from the general to the specific. That would be one way to characterize the organizational pattern. You could also say that we move from a place of distance to a place of nearness. Or another word for that would be proximity. So even though the author doesn't say first, next, and finally, it is organized. And let me show you how I know it's organized. Could you cut apart paragraphs 2, 3, 4, and 5 and rearrange them and still have the same meaning in this essay? The answer is no. There is a deliberate reason why the idea about the bridge comes before the idea about the feeling of invincibility, and a reason why those two ideas come before empowerment, and a reason why that comes before ownership. So there is a deliberate choice in why the details are organized this way. Now, you may be thinking, I didn't even see that. I didn't get that as I read it. Good. The author did his job. You see, here's the key about good writing. Good writing is so subtly organized that you don't even realize that it's organized. That's the kind of writing I'm asking you to do. So it's easy to say first, next, and finally. That's the easy way to write. This is the more challenging. This is the collegiate way of writing, where you have a deliberate organizational structure, but it doesn't call attention to itself. It's subtle. So if you get that about this essay, you've learned the most important thing about this model. That subtle organization is the key. The next question said, considering the ideas you identified in question 2, so those are the ideas we mentioned, what does the bridge represent to the writer? In your answers, you got this, and you talked about how it represents ownership, a place of belonging. It's that place where the author and his friends can go and they feel like they can get away from the cares and worries of the world. And don't we all want to have that sense of belonging? And so the overall theme of this essay is it's about a bridge, it's about a place. But far more important are the ideas and the feelings that we connect with that place. And it says, state the thesis of the essay in your own words. So by stating it in our own words, there's a new term that I want you to be familiar with and to use, and that is implied thesis. And so the implied thesis statement is the idea that you state it in your own words. It is not directly stated. Okay, the opposite of that would be an explicit thesis. If you've ever downloaded music and it's got the little E beside of it, what does that mean? It means that it has explicit lyrics. They don't hint at things, but it comes right out and says it. So this essay uses an implied thesis. So if you were trying to make a statement, a declarative sentence of its thesis statement, it would probably be something to the effect, and I can look at your responses and see some of the thesis statements that you suggested. For example, the four of us out on the Woodbridge have a place to belong. We sit without a worry on our minds at the bridge. What you really don't want to do with an implicit thesis is you don't want to just pick out and say, okay, right here, this is the thesis statement. But instead, you're developing the thesis statement yourself. So if you look at paragraph 6, I haven't yet found a place where I could be so much in my own world and in my own element as I could when I was at the bridge. Having my best friends and cheap cigars make me enjoy it even more. That's probably where you get the main idea. That's probably where you get the thesis statement. But neither of those sentences alone constitutes the thesis statement per se. You would have to develop that yourself. So you might make a statement that says, the bridge is a place where my friends and I feel as if we belong. That's the thesis. The author didn't have to come right out and say that. Remember, it's all about subtlety. So the essay is so carefully controlled that everything leads you to that conclusion, and you arrive at that conclusion in paragraph 6. So that's the beauty of an implied or implicit thesis statement. Technique and style questions. The first question asked about sentence fragment, and it said to examine the second and third sentences to think about what kind of thesis or what kind of fragments these are. So here are the fragments. The four of us sitting on the Woodbridge puffing on our cheap Swisher cigars. The smoke rising above the rusty cast iron sides and filtering up to the full moon above. So those are two sentence fragments. A sentence fragment is either missing a subject or a predicate. What's missing in these two fragments? The four of us. What is the subject? Four. That's the grammatical subject of the sentence. The four of us sitting out on a wood bridge puffing on our cheap Swisher cigars. Puffing looks like a verb, but it's not a verb in that sentence, so it's missing a predicate. So you have a subject fragment. The smoke rising above the rusty cast iron sides. Here, smoke is the grammatical subject. So again, you have a subject fragment. We are missing two predicates. In other words, we're missing the verbs. Why would the author do that? He's focusing on the visual. So this paragraph is all about appealing to your sense of sight. So it's an appeal to the visual sense. Let me tell you something about good description. Good description appeals to the five senses. It makes you see it, smell it, taste it, feel it, hear it. That's what good descriptive writing is. And so one of the ways you can have good visual impact is to use a sentence fragment effectively that just focuses on the subject, the thing, the four of us, the smoke. So that's the image that's created in your mind. So by using sentence fragments, the author here has made a deliberate choice to help you visualize, to have very good description. 2 is about sentence variety, and it says that if you vary the length of your sentences, you'll find that your prose, and maybe that's a word we need to talk about, the word prose simply means writing that is in paragraph form. So in other words, you have basically 2 categories of writing. You've got prose, which would be like essay writing, and you have poetry. So anything written in verse is poetry, anything written in essay style is prose. So your prose needs a variety of sentence types and lengths. We call that syntax. So anytime we're talking about syntax, we're talking about the length of sentences and the arrangement of ideas. So you should have a variety of short sentences, medium sentences, and long sentences. So if you look back through the essay, you can find that there are places where there are very short sentences next to very long sentences. For example, let's look at this sentence right here. No one could touch us. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 words in that sentence. I would call that a short sentence. And then you've got, we were like 1920 bootleg gangsters that the law couldn't catch up with. That would be a medium length sentence. We were almost invincible as we smoked our cigars and talked about our dreams and aspirations. That's a medium length sentence. So what's the impact of doing that? You want your writing to have a natural cadence and rhythm to it. In other words, you want it to sound like your voice, as if you're speaking to someone. So your natural cadence or rhythm of speaking involves short sentences, long sentences, medium length sentences. So your writing, your prose should be the same. Also, if you use really short sentences, it can be very impactful and give you some emphasis. So you can control the pacing of your writing by controlling the syntax. That's the point to get from this. It says reread paragraph 2, which sentence functions as the topic sentence. Now, the topic sentence is the one sentence that has the main idea in it. So the bridge looks like it's something from a surreal movie with a midnight atmosphere. Then it tells you where it's located, what it looks like. So really that first sentence there, that's the topic sentence. And it all has to do with that main idea that we identified of describing the bridge. The 4th question said repetition can be effective or ineffective. Explain how you judge Holland's similar sentence beginnings in paragraph 3. So if you look at paragraph 3, you're going to find we were at the bridge. We felt as though, we thought, we stayed, we felt, we could. Do you see the pattern here? That we were. So over and over again, the emphasis is on the collective, plural, personal pronoun we with a past tense verb, were, felt, thought, could. So sometimes repetition is unnecessary, but sometimes repetition is good. In this case, I would judge it as being good because the emphasis is on we. So it's that idea of we, all 4 of us felt as if we were together in this. And so that's why he repeats that very similar syntax, sentence pattern. And this says reread paragraph 5, looking for details that appeal to the senses. What are they? In paragraph 5, you're going to see, so you've got visual. You're going to see a cool summer night. That's a tactile imagery. You can feel it. You can feel the coolness. The windy, you could feel that again. The cooing, you can hear that. So if you want to talk about types of imagery, You could talk about in paragraph 5 the fact that there is visual imagery. Let me change that color real quick. So you've got visual imagery, you've got auditory imagery, you can hear it, and you've got tactile imagery. And that's just another way of saying you can feel it, your sense of touch. And so, again, one of the hallmarks of good descriptive writing is that you appeal to as many different types of images, types of senses that you can, so that you're transporting your reader into that. Okay. Hopefully that helps you better understand, and I've heavily annotated for you so that you can see the subtlety of organization and the appeal to senses as making up good descriptive writing. Now, what I want you to do today is I'm giving you 2 topics for a journal writing assignment. You only pick one of them, and you write a well-written paragraph in response to one of those journal topics. Don't write about both, just pick one. I'm looking for about 7 complete sentences in response to that, and this could actually turn into a pre-writing activity for you when you get the writing prompt for the narrative essay assignment that's due on August 28th. Again, if you've got questions, don't hesitate to email me, and I'll be glad to try to help you as much as I can. Hello, and welcome back to Class for English 111. This is the class for August 19th. So yesterday, you had an assignment to write a journal entry in response to one of 2 prompts from Jason Holland's The Bridge, and many of you chose to write about a place. And that's good pre-writing for the narrative essay that's coming up to you next Friday. So you will receive writing prompts this coming Friday, and then you'll have a full week to write a draft, get some feedback and revision suggestions from me, and then turn out a final draft on August 28th. So at this point, there's no expectation that you have started that assignment. We're doing things to get ready for that assignment. So we have worked through The Bridge as an example, and today, in the materials, you have an essay called The Night of Oranges. So I want to spend just a little bit of time getting you ready to read that. So I want you to practice the close reading skills you learned from the Adler article. And I want you to be able to answer the 5 discussion questions that I've posted as an assignment in a Google form. But there's some things in those questions that I want us to talk about first so that you read with a purpose and know what you should be looking for. So both essays, The Bridge and The Night of Oranges, use description and narration. So let's talk about those modes of development. Description characterizes any writing in which the author is using details and appealing to the 5 senses in such a way that they're trying to recreate an experience for you. Probably all kinds of writing that you do is going to rely upon description as a mode of development. Narration is a specific mode of development that we're studying right now, where the author narrates events that have happened. And there are lots of different techniques that an author can use in order to narrate a sequence of events. And so we're reading The Night of Oranges as an example of how the author effectively uses different writing techniques for narration. One of the questions you're going to be asked about today is, to what extent does the author answer the journalistic questions? And so it's probably good for us to talk about what do we mean by the journalistic questions. Any good journalist in writing an article, whether that be a hard news story or a feature story or a sports story, is going to answer the important questions of who, what, where, when, why, and how. And so in an introduction to an essay, traditionally, you've probably written 1 paragraph as your introduction, and it sets the scene. And it probably answers to some extent some of those journalistic questions. Who are we talking about? What's happening? Why is it happening? And then the rest of your body paragraphs flesh that out. The model essays that we're reading, and for example, the essay for today is 13 paragraphs. You're going to have a multi-paragraph introduction. So the first 3 paragraphs, maybe, you could say, provide the introduction. And they answer the who, what, where, when, why, and how of the essay. Then the remaining paragraphs constitute the body of the paragraph. But when it asks about those journalistic questions, it's just asking you to think about what details has the author chosen to give you and what questions has the author answered for you. A lot of that has to do with audience awareness, knowing what the reader doesn't know and anticipating misconceptions and being able to describe and narrate that for you so that it's answering those questions as you get to it. If you get to the end of the essay and you say, well, I really don't know what that was about or who that was about or why that happened or when it happened, then the author hasn't met the audience's needs. So that's why we're bringing up journalistic questions with this essay. There's also a question about chronological order, which is just sequencing events in time order. So this happened first, then this, and finally this was the last thing chronologically that happened. It's time order. And that's typically the mode of development for narrative writing. You're going to tell a story, narrate an event. You begin at the beginning and you end at the end. Now, occasionally you will begin in what's called in medias res, which means right in the middle of the action, which is a feature of a lot of good pieces of literature. And it's actually a feature of lots of good movies that you've probably watched over and over again. It doesn't begin at the chronological beginning. It begins right in the smack of middle of the action because that's far more interesting than the chronological beginning. And so what happens in a movie like that or a TV series like that is you begin in the middle of the action, and then it doesn't answer maybe one of those journalistic questions, but down the road in a few episodes or near the end of the movie, all of those questions are filled in for you. Otherwise, you get to the end of the movie and you're unsatisfied with it. So that's how you can strategically place narrative details in a chronological or an asynchronous order in order to build an overall effect. There's also a question about the thesis for this essay. And again, we're looking at essays that use implicit thesis. By the way, I'm looking at these key terms over here on the slide today. The opposite is an explicit thesis, which is directly stated. An implicit thesis is implied. In other words, it doesn't come right out and say it, but it builds to a general point that you have to identify as the reader. The question today about implied thesis says that on the surface level, this essay has one implied thesis. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you're going to find something else. So I've included the word symbolism here as a reminder to you. When you get to that question today about the implied thesis, I want you to think about symbolism. So the title of this essay is The Night of Oranges. That's literally talking about an orange, a piece of citrus fruit. Okay? The time that this takes place is on the eve of revolution in Romania. And there's something that happens with the narrator involving being able to purchase oranges and the feeling that he has when he's purchased those oranges and he takes them home to his family. And it happens to be Christmas Eve. I want you to think about, what does the orange symbolize? I'm not going to answer that question for you. I want you to think about it as you read. If you can figure out what the oranges symbolize, then you're going to be well equipped to answer the question in today's discussion about the thesis statement. So kind of put those two ideas together, symbolism of the oranges and the implied thesis. Then there's going to be a question about past and present tense. So if I were to ask you, what did you do last weekend? You're probably going to say, well, I went to do this, and I did this. I mowed the yard. I went to the lake. I worked on Saturday. I attended church service on Sunday. Notice that all those verbs that I just used were in the past tense. Now, why is that the case? Because when we narrate about past events, typically we use the past tense. It's just part of English language. I want to read to you from the first paragraph of Flavius Stan's essay, The Night of Oranges. It is Christmas Eve in 1989 in Timisoara, and the ice is still dirty from the boots of the Romanian Revolution. The dictator, Nicolae Ceausescu, has been deposed a few days before, and on Christmas Day he would be executed by firing squad. I am in the center of the city with my friends, empty now of the crowds that prayed outside the cathedral during the worst of the fighting. My friends and I still hear shots here and there. Our cold hands are gray like the sky above us, and we want to see a movie. Now I'm going to go back and I'm going to pull out the verbs for you. Now pay attention to the verbs. Is, am, here, are, want. Notice none of those are in the past tense. They're in the present tense. So the author has made a deliberate choice to narrate, and he wrote this in 1995 about an event that happened in 1989. So he's 6 years past the event, yet he still writes about it in the present tense. There's a reason for that. He's made a deliberate choice. That's the question I want you to answer. Why did the author choose to write about a past event in present tense? And why is that a good writing strategy for narration? What does it give you, the reader, to read about a past event in present tense? Incidentally, that's going to be one of the techniques that I'm going to ask you to try out when you write your essay next week, of your essay number 1 of narration that uses effective description, is to narrate about a past event, but to use present tense verbs to do that. So pay close attention to the verbs and try to figure out what's the impact, what's the effect, and we'll talk about that in tomorrow's class. Then on Friday, hello and welcome to class for August 20th. Today we're looking at The Night of Oranges by Flavius Stan. Yesterday, you should have answered the discussion questions and submitted those in the Google form. I want to spend a few minutes talking about those questions. And today's assignment is for you to write a journal response. You have 2 prompts. You respond in a well-written paragraph to one of those prompts for today's participation. So just want to spend a few minutes then thinking about the essay from yesterday and annotating some things about this essay. One of the first things that I wanted you to notice about this essay is the fact that it is written in first-person point of view. So that's important to remember. First-person point of view, which will be a requirement for essay number 1. The narrative essay will be written from a first-person point of view. And so that uses pronouns like I. I also wanted you to notice that it is written in present tense. So we talked about that a little bit yesterday in our discussion, that even though it's about a past event, he opts for the present tense. And so one of the things you'll do in essay 1 is write a first-person narrative using present tense about a past event. And so you may never have done that before. But the impact that it has, and if you didn't read this little blurb, that it might help you understand a little bit about what's going on in the essay. The impact of that is that it stresses the immediacy of the action. It puts you right into the middle of it by using that present tense. You feel as if you're standing right alongside the author as he narrates these events. And so it just humor me and let's read this paragraph together here. Few of us reading this essay have had firsthand experience of a revolution, nor have many of us lived under communism or a dictatorship, much less a government whose leader was not only overthrown but also executed. But all of us know oranges. Okay, so here's kind of a critical point. The author is writing about something that is unfamiliar to most of his audience. So in order to connect with his audience and demonstrate audience awareness, he uses a familiar object, an orange. We're all familiar with the experience of an orange or eating an orange. What is familiar to us was strange to Stan, and what is strange to us was his everyday world. So revolution is strange to us, but his ability to go to the market and buy an orange was unheard of, because living in a communist regime, the market is restricted, and so that was just something that was not available to the citizens of Romania. So notice that contrast. So this is an essay about contrasts, and so the contrast exists between what's familiar to the audience and what's familiar with the author of the essay. So I think that makes it very interesting when you think about it that way. The resulting gap between Stan's society and ours is huge. Yet in this essay, he is able to bring his reader into the cold, post-revolution world of a city in Romania and make us see our familiar orange in a new way. Read the essay once for pleasure and then read it again looking for the ways in which he makes the unfamiliar familiar and vice versa. And so notice there, even the directions here indicate you should read multiple times these very short model essays so that you get them and understand them. One of the tips I gave you yesterday for answering the question about the thesis statement, and the question said, on the surface, Stan's essay has a simple thesis that finding the rare and perfect gift for his brother fills him with pride. Pride also reflected by his family. Remember, it's Christmas Eve. If you dig a bit, however, you may also discover other less obvious theses. What, for instance, might Stan be implying about Christmas and about Romania's future? So I asked you to think about symbolism. So hopefully, and I saw this in some of your answers, you connected the idea that the orange represents freedom. And you could even extend that a little bit further and say the sweet taste of the orange represents the sweet taste of freedom. Aha, right? That's big. That's a subtle little detail in that essay, but it's where it all connects and where it all comes together. He's taking something so simple like an orange and making it universal, that it has a cosmic sort of implication here about freedom. He's never had the ability to go out and buy an orange for his family. And that's where that wellspring of pride comes from, that he finally has the ability to provide his family with something as simple as an orange, but it is indicative of Romania is on the eve of revolution. It's not just Christmas Eve, but it's the eve of revolution. Romania is poised to have freedom. And freedom means having the simple joys of life that I think we in our society take for granted. Possibly during this pandemic, you've become a little bit more acutely aware of how good it is to have freedom, and how maybe a year ago today we took for granted our ability to attend school. We took for granted our ability to gather in large groups, to play sports, to attend a movie theater. We kind of take those things for granted. And now, living through a pandemic, we understand that's something to be greatly valued. And so that coincides with what Flavius Stan is doing in this essay by using that orange as a symbol of the freedom for Romania. If you can write like that, you could be paid to be a writer. So that's why we're reading these essays, because these are great writers. One of the other questions was about the effect of using chronological order. When you're writing a narrative, that's typically going to be the mode of development. It's just going to be in time sequence. And so that's what he does. The only twist he adds to that is he narrates it in present tense, even though he's writing in 1995. It happened in 1989. There's a 6-year gap. But let me speak to that for just a moment. If you're writing about a past event that happened last weekend, you're only going to have the benefit of a week that has passed to reflect on the significance of that event in your life. If you write about an event that occurred 5 years ago, you've got the benefit of 5 years of reflection, of thinking about what does that event mean to me and what significance does it have. So as you think about writing about a past event using the present tense, I would go back. And the further back that you can go, probably the better reflection you're going to have. There is a really cool image that William Faulkner creates in The Sound and the Fury. There's a character in that novel who lives almost exclusively just in the past, like his mind dwells in the past. He doesn't deal with the present, and he certainly doesn't think about the future. And there's an image of that character in The Sound and the Fury where he is on the back of a train and he's looking behind him. And the imagery that's whirling past him as the train moves forward and he looks backwards is all in a blur. Like, you can't make any sense of it. But then as it converges toward the horizon, the farther the scenery gets away from him, the more clearly focused it becomes. That's kind of the sense of past events in your life. Maybe you had a traumatic event happen a year ago, and in the moment, you didn't even realize the impact that it was having on you. But after a year's worth of reflection and you've processed it, it's converged onto the horizon and become just incredibly clearly focused for you. That's what Flavius Stan is doing. In one of the journal prompts today, you're asked to think about narrating a past event, but to crawl inside the skin of yourself at that age and narrate it from that perspective. It's almost as if the narrator goes back to his 11-year-old self to narrate the sheer joy that he has in buying these oranges. And I love how he, in paragraph 7, characterizes the clerk. Now, that's a pretty basic sort of job that someone might hold. But here, the clerk has gone from anonymity, no one knowing his name, to unexpected importance. So what do you suppose that means? Well, he goes on and says, as he handles the oranges, he acts like a movie star in front of his fans. That is fantastic, right? So it's elevated the ordinary. Someone who he's selling things in a market, but now he has something that everyone wants. He has oranges, and it's that idea of freedom. And so he moves his arms in an exaggerated manner as he tells the other workers where to go and what to do. All I can do is stare at the stack of cardboard boxes piled higher than me. I have never seen so many oranges in my life. Again, we take for granted some of the joys that we have in life. I think that is just a fantastic description there. One other thing I want to say about this essay, and I hope you noticed this. When we talked about the bridge, we talked about sentence length, and there was a question about short, medium, long sentences and the idea that you control the cadence and the rhythm of the essay. If you had to just in general talk about the syntax of Flavius Stan's writing style, and remember, syntax is about word order and sentence length, okay? Generally speaking, his sentences are medium to long. There's a variety of sentence patterns that he exhibits, but he writes in first person point of view, present tense narration, and has medium to long sentences. And so you're kind of wrapped up in this description and this narration until you get to paragraph 13. And again, remember, we're breaking the mold of the 5-paragraph essay. So not every paragraph has to have 5 sentences. This one has 3 sentences. Now I want you to notice something here. I stare at my brother eating the oranges. They are my oranges. My parents are proud of me. Did you notice there how the syntax, the deliberate choice to use short sentences that almost have a staccato type rhythm to them, slows you down in that moment? And so you've read detail, detail, detail. There's this flurry of activity and things are just fever pitch. There's a lot of things happening, a lot of moving parts. And then he gets back home and it slows down. I stare at my brother eating the oranges. They are my oranges. My parents are proud of me. So that's a deliberate choice that the author uses there to make you pause and reflect. And ultimately, that points you to the thesis statement. The thesis about Christmas is more than just receiving a gift. The thesis that the oranges symbolize the freedom that Romania is about to experience. And the thesis that this is self-sacrificing what the author has done. He had money to go see a movie, but instead of using it on himself, he chose to spend that money on his brother and his family. So it's that idea of sacrifice. And again, that ties into the theme of freedom in a whole new light. So all of those things work together, even though he doesn't have one declarative sentence in this essay that you could put your finger on and say, that's the thesis. It doesn't have an explicit thesis. It builds to an overall implied thesis that is multifaceted. And isn't that a much better mode of writing? Isn't that much more subtle and careful and just a more in-depth way of writing? Again, we're reading these 2 essays